Hi, this is Kit, and I'm going to talk you through my simple circle skirt right here. Now, if you're not familiar with a circle skirt, it is a pretty simple concept. It's like taking a big square and folding it into quarters, and then you demarcate around that folded corner a cut for the waist and then a cut for the full skirt. And so when you're done, you'll have this big donut shape of fabric. So to do this, you need, of course, an adequate size of square fabric, but you also need to do some good old-fashioned math. So everyone remembers circumference equals 2 pi times the radius, and solving for the radius, you can see the equation there. Now, the circumference is basically the measurement around your hips or waist. And I'm doing this originally for my 5-year-old, although I made a mistake later on that I'll tell you about. And her hips measured at 26 inches. So I need to use that number in order to find the radius, which is going to allow me to cut in that smaller circle in the donut so that it's sized for a waist. Now, what I messed up on is I did not account for adding like a seam with a waist band with elastic, and so my radius actually grew substantially and it wound up with a much larger circumference, and so this skirt ends up being for my 11-year-old, but that's getting ahead of myself. So you can see here I have this nice little square of fabric. To draw the circumference, I'm just using some yarn that I have on hand and a yellow crayon and then sketching it out. So with it sped up, the crayon, you have to kind of go over and over and over and over again for it to eventually show up enough in order to cut. Kids in the background probably. So I'm just using my radial cutter. I'm cutting through 4 layers of fabric. So I had to put a lot of pressure in here, and there was a bit that didn't come separated completely. Ooh, pretty close to my thumb there. A little bit scary to watch. So just getting that edge. This will be the, of course, skirt's end at this point. Now I have all this leftover fabric, and I wanted to create a waistband because I want to be able to have elastic in there for my daughter. That's why I sized this for her hips, not her waist, because it needed to go over her hips. So I'm just pulling out like about a 3-inch, 3 to 4 inches. I would actually shoot for like 4 inches to 5 inches of fabric, and making kind of a little rectangle there by cutting off the edges and making it nice and neat. And I will use that later by sewing them together. Now with my radius, I am going to mark the waist. So again, I messed up here and I made it too big because I didn't account for adding in that waistband. So if you're going to add in a waistband, I would retract 1 inch from your radius because of the seam. But you can see here, this is how it would work. So granted, I did the math wrong and this became an 11-year-old skirt, but everything else conceptually works. So again, I'm checking to make sure that I got the radius correctly. I think I had to redo it a little bit with my, oh no, it was correct. Cool. So just again, cutting that out with a lot of pressure, cutting through 4 layers of fabric. And here you can see my basic donut is ready. Now already that, that cut is looking pretty big actually for a 5-year-old. So at this point, I'm going to sew all of these together. You can kind of see my bald head because I decided to shave my head during quarantine. So that's been actually quite fun. So I sewed all of those little rectangles together. So I have my waistband. Now I'm going to deploy a technique that I just learned, which is called a French seam. So what I'm doing is I'm putting the wrong sides of the fabric together. So normally when you do a seam, you want to have the right sides of the fabric together because then the seam will be on the inside of the fabric, not on the outside. So doing this, I'm going to have a seam on the outside of the skirt. It's going to look horrible, but that's part of this technique. It's really neat, and I wish that I had known it when I made my fancy lace Easter dresses for my daughters. It would have been just a nicer finish on those garments. So again, pinning around that seam really nicely, and I'm folding the fabric. I guess I didn't explain that, that is so that I'll be able to run elastic through this waistband, and it'll all be self-contained already. So even though it looks like maybe the wrong side of the fabric is on the wrong side of the fabric, it's already flipped over. So the wrong side of the waistband is against the wrong side of the skirt. So this will all make sense in a moment. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to stitch that so you can see it there. And oh no, there's a seam on the wrong side. It's on the nice side of the fabric. Well, what you're going to do is you're actually going to seam it again. So you're going to flip it and you're going to sew that nasty raw edge in. So you're going to have like this pressed little seam on the inside of the garment. Now I decided to do this especially because my daughter gets perturbed by any kind of pokiness on the inside of a garment. She was already complaining about the Easter dress, unfortunately. So you can see how that turns out after it's sewn in. It's so lovely. I'm really excited that I learned this recently in another pattern. And so the last couple things to do are, of course, the elastic. And this is where it became very, very, very clear that this skirt was too large in the waist department for a 5-year-old. It would have been ridiculous to put this on her. You can see how big that is. So to run elastic, I don't really show this, but you secure a safety pin to a piece of elastic and then you just kind of thread it through. So you can see I have the elastic in, I have it pinned together. I've sized it to my 11-year-old, so I know it's the right size for her. And you can see even for her, I have to do like quite a lot of scrunching on this waistband, so it doesn't look as neat and tidy as I would have liked it to have been. And this seam is not super great, but where the elastic is and me closing that hole, I'll learn a new technique another day. Now the last part is of course the hem, and so I'm going to actually do a rolled hem for this. So the first thing that you do to make this neat, if you're not the straightest of sewers, and I'm not the straightest of sewers myself, if I'm not going along an edge, is you sew 1/4 inch away from the raw edge of the fabric. And then you can see I'm in a different place because I forgot to grab this footage up at my table. I'm about to iron this, and I hate ironing, but it is really important that you iron it. So I'm ironing it with 1/8 inch. See, the little sewn part is 1/8 inch or so from the ironed folded edge. And so that actually becomes a sewing guide for making the first stitch in this rolled hem. So I just sew straight over that line that I sewed in, and the fold is nice there. And now, because it's already sewn once and there's a nice crisp edge, I just kind of turn it an additional time in order to make the rolled hem. And that is what is going on here. So you can see it's nice and secured. The raw edge is not showing whatsoever, so it's not going to fray with multiple washings. I guess that's also important with this because I expect it to be like a commonly worn skirt. So here's my 11-year-old demonstrating her new skirt and quite enjoying it. She wore it all the next day after I made this. Now you'll see here a photo of this skirt. Kind of a still that I showed in the very beginning of this video. And there we are. And there's it like spread out. I don't know. Wrong terminology. But this is again a very full skirt because it's a circle skirt. Now, I felt horrible because I promised my little 5-year-old and I was sizing this skirt for her, and then suddenly it becomes her older sister's skirt. And, despite informing her that it will eventually be her skirt because of hand-me-downs, I decided I would make up a quick circle skirt for her and get it right this time in the waist radius. So instead of a 4.25 inch radius, I actually used a 3-inch radius because of how large this waist ended up looking, and it barely fits over her hips, but it fits her waist perfectly, and there's not a lot of awkward scrunching at the top, so I think it was a win. So there you can see a little bit of a spin and demonstration, and hopefully this is something that you can use up some time and extra fabric making for your daughters. Cheers!